first, before I go into my 5 tips, I just want to provide the context for some of those tips, because I know that we are an interdisciplinary and we might be at different career stages, we might be at different types of institutions, we might be in different types of departments. And so sometimes, that will help contextualize some of the things I'm saying, if it does or doesn't maybe apply to your situation. So of course, I'm a psychologist, and I work in a pretty applied psychology department in general, but in in a pretty traditional psychology program context, not in a school of public health or a school of medicine, for instance. And so that of course dictates some of the tips that I'll give and the experiences I've had. I also, my department is situated in a college at NC State called the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Psychology is sometimes in colleges of arts and sciences, which sometimes receive different funding at the college level than a college that's more associated with humanities. That's not true everywhere, but just in general, there can be differences in that regard. I'm an associate professor now, just recently turned associate professor, just got tenure that took effect in August. Thank you. Yeah. Really be a whole nother session on getting tenure that I could talk about ad nauseum. But I'm going to try to focus these tips on lessons learned, especially in early career, and things that I kind of wish I had known or had heard about when I started out. And the context I'll predominantly be talking about, although I came from a small liberal arts college, which is my first position, to NC State as my second assistant professor position. That context is an R1 research intensive university where I have doctoral students. Might not be the case for everyone. And I also had, startup funds to contribute towards personnel. And that may or may not be the case for everyone as well. So a lab to me includes things like a physical space. This might not be the same for every psychologist or for some of you, but I mention it here because it impacts the tips I'm going to give. It includes a physical space. I do a variety of different types of research, from quantitative and qualitative methods to, so for a physical space on campus for interviews and focus groups, though they don't all have to be in person, as well as equipment. I do also some psychophysiological research. And so equipment, for instance, blood pressure monitors, and ECG and ICG and that kind of stuff also is what my lab includes, as well as computing. And then at my institution, we had to budget in for every tiny thing like Post-it notes and pens and paper and all the other and office furniture and things like that. So that's what a physical kind of lab space is to me. And that also includes, when I say staff, I'm using kind of the terms that I think some of you all might be using, but really personnel for me has majority been graduate students in my experience, doctoral students. Some folks have lab managers who they hire who are maybe post baccalaureates or other positions who they hire to come on to just manage the lab or do things like that. But the majority of my experience has been with graduate students serving in those roles, getting paid to serve in those roles through my startup funds. I also recently have hired some research assistants or research technicians who are not graduate students, but I haven't had a project manager or lab manager that I've recruited to start a project. It's been mostly graduate students. And I would say that there are pros and cons to each that we can talk about as well. So the majority of my staff include doctoral students predominantly, have included undergraduate research assistants off and on throughout the years, as well as, 1 or 2 temporary research technicians funded for a year or something from a grant-funded project, as well as sometimes I've shared some hours with a postdoctoral fellow that hasn't been my postdoctoral fellow, but has been someone else's. So that's who I'm talking about when I'm talking about staff, and that's what I'm talking about in my context when I'm talking about a lab. Okay, so the tips. My first tip is know yourself first, and I think this is really important. So what do I mean by that? There's a lot of different aspects to know oneself on. For me, I realized over time the importance of knowing my own working communication styles, including my pet peeves and all of kind of my own unique personality quirks. Um, because sometimes when recruiting or thinking about personnel, sometimes I was really focused on making sure that the personnel that I recruited, I could kind of train them, and that's great. But sometimes I did so at the expense of kind of what were some red flags in the interview process, or some flags, but some points of discomfort, or like, oh, I don't know about that. I don't know if that's going to work for me. And so, even though this might not be the most important thing, I think it's really important to know what you need, both, professionally, which is my next point, as well as kind of your own quirks, so that you can create the best and most productive environment in your lab possible. Also, knowing yourself in terms of your funding situation, right? How much money do you have to put towards staff? Or what funding packages do you have for students? What are opportunities to get funding? So there might be an internal grant that you can hire someone for a year versus an R01, where if you get it, it's 5 years, versus startup funds where, it might be a 3-year package for a graduate student. What are some additional opportunities to recruit undergraduate research assistants, for instance? In our case, we can recruit them through federal work study. They can do a course credit, and they can also do a bunch of other professional experience programs in our college. So knowing kind of what are the opportunities out there. And then knowing institutional processes and structures. So how long will it take to hire someone? What's the like, what are the hoops that you have to jump through at your institution for different types of hires? How many hours per week can that person work without it being considered full-time or part-time? All of that nuance. And how do you learn about those things? Well, certainly know who to ask in terms of who does the finance, the booking, or who manages that, but also ask other faculty or ask other folks who've done this. I found that that's been the best in terms of giving me tips and tricks and preparing in advance for some of the long times it can take, at least at state institutions, to complete the hiring process, because that can really slow you down. Similarly, your needs for a given position, and that might change over time. It might be that you really need someone to help you collect all this data. You have the funding to do it, and you need someone who's going to help you collect the data. It might be that you need someone who's going to help you with a literature review, or someone who knows a certain statistical procedure. And all those things are really important to know. Sometimes I've hired generally on potential or trainability, and that's important and that's good. Like, we shouldn't ignore that. But sometimes if I have a specific need and I don't hire or consider that need first, then it ends up just being me doing it, actually, because the person I've hired is fabulous, but they don't fill that need that I have in the short or long term. And that relates to, right, your specific goals, short and long-term goals for projects, for your lab, and create a list for yourself and think, what are my at this point already on the road? And any good applicants for these positions will also ask you that. So it's good practice to do that anyway. My second tip is just structure, structure, structure. I'm a very structured person, and I think it's come in handy in my lab. So what do I mean by structure? So I suggest, designing your ideal structure for the lab, and I'll give some examples of that, and clearly communicate those expectations to, clearly yourself, talk honestly with yourself, but also to your staff and your team at all different levels. So what are everyone's roles? So it might be that, right, you clearly specify, well, this position or this role, this graduate student is going to work on this project and is going to do this thing for it, versus this undergraduate research assistant is going to help with this other thing. And it's really helpful to be transparent about those roles. I think for graduate students, in my experience, they don't always realize that sometimes a big part of what I'm doing is writing grants so I can continue to fund them. but being transparent about that, like, right now you're, I'm hiring or looking for someone to fill this need, kind of boots on the ground position, while I write something to hopefully on this important work and to hopefully fund these positions, because that's also a big responsibility, I think, especially if you don't have a more permanent kind of graduate student package. If you have funding for only a year and you're hiring someone, you have to worry, I would take on the responsibility of like, okay, how do I continue to beyond that year? So being clear about the roles and what everyone is doing will help reduce redundancy and increase transparency. Design your ideal time for meetings, or how frequently, how long. I have probably too many meetings, so it's not good to ask me about. You can ask me about this, but I have both individual meetings with these and with my other staff, as well as group meetings, and maybe individual meetings are biweekly or monthly, and group meetings with all of us together be weekly or biweekly or something like that. So think about what your own needs are, especially that might vary for your short and long-term goals. If you have a project that you're trying to launch, then you might need to meet more frequently. But setting those expectations kind of upfront and having a scheme in place will. Check-ins are super helpful because oftentimes folks are doing tasks. In my case, at least, I assign tasks and folks do them independently, but they could spend an inordinate amount of time through no fault of their own going down a path that's different than the way they understood the task. And so check-ins are, whether those be weekly, whether those be via email, whether those be on a need-by-need basis, I think are really helpful, as well as progress reports. So the idea of checking in about one's overall progress, not only things that need to be refined, but things that folks are doing well, I think helps build rapport and communication. It can take a lot of time, but I think, I've even done quarterly or bi-monthly check-ins. And I think especially for trainees in the beginning, whether those be undergraduate, graduate students, or any staff who's just getting their feet wet with knowing you and knowing the role, those can be really helpful. I've sometimes had trouble with folks in positions that are hourly, so part-time positions that aren't graduate students always, they can be, but in hourly positions, struggling with getting all of their hours per week that they're being paid for. And so I have sometimes implemented weekly logs. I mean, this is true anyway, sometimes accounting purposes where they have to, or if they're part-time or hourly, but even weekly logs for me, where I ask them to kind of chart which task or parts of task working on in certain categories. So maybe it's emails, which is a big one, email, or recruitment, or running analyses, or whatever it might be. And I ask them to kind of chart their time, and we look at it for a few weeks or something like that. And this can help make sure that not only sometimes challenges meeting hours or things like, but also that if something is taking a real long amount of time, and in your mind, oh gosh, emails should only be taking 2 hours a week rather than 10 hours a week, the point where you can speak with them and talk about strategies for reducing that time, saying, I'd really like us to get you not to get bogged down in this part, what are some solutions? So it can feel kind of a collaborative process of helping them kind of meet some of your helping them to meet their own goals to help you meet your goals. A lab manual is something I have. I found some examples online from other psychologists who actually made their lab manuals. And often these include a description of the lab, mission and vision. So it's kind of also an introduction to the lab, as well as resources, other processes, etc. Helps to crystallize these things. So having a lab manual is certainly an option. I can talk more about that in discussion if you're interested about what goes in there, but having a document where maybe someone doesn't need to come to you or to other folks for every question, but you can say, here's the lab manual, check out this portion of it. Similarly, having And mentorship structure is sometimes helpful. This might not be possible if you're starting staffing from scratch, but for instance, after my doctoral students kind of have a few years under their belt, they then mentor undergraduate research assistants, or postdoctoral folks might mentor doctoral folks, or other folks might work collaboratively depending on the structure. And that can help to make that clear, because then you don't necessarily receive every single email and it bogs you down. But once you have those structures in place, you can also use that as an opportunity for other folks to build their leadership and mentorship skills with your feedback. So it helps to have a structure in place potentially. And then I love this so much. We created some onboarding videos for folks who are coming into our lab. Things like completing your city trainings, your ethics trainings, how to log your hours, how to fill out your times in our shared calendar, like all of the stuff that you don't want to explain over and over and over at the beginning of each semester or hiring period. If you've done it once, you can consider turning that into videos or tutorials to follow, and again and again. That's kind of an onboarding process. We also have a lab retreat at least once a year for when most new folks come on board. And we kind of also go through the projects and kind of orient folks and do some team building there. Setting folks up for success and community early on, I think, is really. And then this is I've always heard this from folks, and I do believe it's true. These are my hot takes, I guess, as well. So don't be afraid to adapt when the structures aren't working or need adaptation or changes. But I will say, I've found, other people have told me this too, but I found it's also true, that it's sometimes easier to get more over time than it is to go the other way. Start off really relaxed or not have a structure or not ask as much from folks, and then suddenly over time ask more and more and more of them, or something like that. So I've found that it's sometimes easier to plan for pie in the sky, and then where everything isn't working out, and we let things go over time, rather than the reverse, because I think that pattern, I'm sure there's research on this, but I've found that it's true that that pattern can feel more overwhelming to folks. So that's my tip about structure. My third tip is delegate, which I have so much trouble with. But I rely, when I feel challenged in this way, I rely on advice from both Bree and Tanae, who I've cited parenthetically here. I've paraphrased, of course. Delegate. So, I think Bree, in one of the office hours, maybe it was a few years ago, said, you have to figure out how to delegate. It's definitely not going to be done perfectly. It's definitely not going to be done like you would have done it, but it's crucial to delegate and to kind of release some of that responsibility and let people do. And it's so hard for me, because I know it can go wrong when this happens. But I do try, and I'll add my own caveat to this at the end that makes it feasible for me. But I do think it's true, and that's a skill I'm learning to grow in. Is it's crucial to delegate. You cannot do it all on your own. And then Tanae, I think, I don't know if it was at the last MIWI meeting together, if I'm misremembering when it was, but said something to the effect of, right, I give them a goal and I say, I don't care how you get there, just get there. And that can sometimes engender additional independence, acknowledgement of the person's own knowledge, their own motivation, right? Encouraging independence. And sometimes because I'm worried about things going wrong and because I have trouble delegating, I sometimes feel like, okay, I have to micromanage every step of the process. But it's true that if you can provide opportunities for independence and for folks to get it done in their own way, as long as they get it done, really that should be, or that could be a more feasible goal. And I think I value independence and critical thinking in those ways more and more among my staff. And it acknowledges their lived experience, their knowledge, their problem solving, and it allows them to be more invested in the projects. So here's my addition that tempers all this. Um, I like to start out delegating with a smaller, less important task for an individual, and then see how it goes. And then I will figure out how much I will delegate to that person and what I will delegate to that person from there. So this is what keeps me a little saner in the process of trying to follow Bree and Tanae's advice, is that, it's not like you're going to start by delegating to them, that they're going to fill out every important piece of paperwork and all your financial documents, something like that for the grant. But, use small instances to test it out. And, you can provide one round of feedback on something that's not as important, and see how it goes. So you're still acknowledging people's own development. You're helping them adapt to your own expectations. But at the same time, you're not kind of just sinking your whole research program because someone unintentionally made a bunch of mistakes along the way. So that's my tempering of this tip 3, which is delegate. Okay. Oops. And then provide feedback, right? So I think I said that part already. Provide feedback for the folks if they don't, if the smaller task doesn't go as planned, but also have a backup plan. Like, don't, it's a lot of responsibility. You're the one that's going to be responsible for it in the end. So even as you work to help folks develop skill, grow, the work still needs to get done. And so always have kind of a backup plan in mind too, for, okay, if they're not going to do it, who will do it? How will it get done, etc., while you're also balancing their own professional development. Okay, these last 2 tips are kind of more on the interviewing or recruiting folks, recruiting staff. So the first one, interviewing, I just want to acknowledge it's sometimes challenging in early career to find staff who might fit all of the qualifications that you might be looking for a variety of reasons. But one that I think I underestimated starting out is that, especially for graduate students, but certainly even for other positions, sometimes your options are limited to who is in your pool of applicants. And who is in your pool of applicants is sometimes based on the stage of your career and how well known you are. So I got way fewer doctoral student applicants, when I first started out than when I did now, what I do now. And so even year to year, other constraints, the pool is, you're working with a pool of folks who are applying, and that can be a constraint. So that being said, right, consider recruiting strategies for staff. Certainly make sure your website is up to date. I think a lot of folks use websites to kind of signal the values and mission of their work in lab, as well as social media, which has become really popular. If you have and LinkedIn, certainly that too, and other forms of social media like Twitter, or even Blue Sky is pretty popular now, and other forms like that. Authentic and professional, not like you don't have to post your individual Facebook or Twitter or something like that. And then listservs, right? Professional development listservs, for instance, professional society listservs can be other recruiting techniques. I've also in the past emailed every single person, I know this is wild, every single person I knew at the time, and said, hey, do you have any candidates? I sent them individual emails. I think I sent over 100 emails. That was, of course, my best recruiting year, but then I was just like, I probably can't email them every year and ask them that. So word of mouth is also important as well, conferences, etc. But keep that in mind as well, because that can really sometimes, your pool of applicants can sometimes really constrain you. Plan interview questions and your interview process in advance. We can talk way more about what questions to ask and what's the process on if you have questions about that, but just make sure you have a plan. It can be really highly indicative. As I mentioned before, there are pros and cons in my view, and we can talk more about this, of different types of staff. So graduate students, postdocs, lab managers or project coordinators. There's pros and cons of that in terms of what you might want, your goals might be, and what skills they might have, etc. There's also practical considerations in terms of, your institution and what their policies are for hiring externally. Is it easier to get a graduate student than it is to get an external person? How much money do you have to spend on this, if any? So all of those things kind of play a role, but it's important to kind of weigh the pros and cons, so that you can broadcast the position that's going to be at the intersection of what's practical for you and what you really need. I do, I'm a little intense, but I feel like it replicates to how I run my lab, so it's all okay. A little intense in my interview process, heard compared to other people. I do multiple rounds of interviews, not usually more than 2, but sometimes 3. And I usually ask applicants to complete a relevant along the way. So sometimes I've had them graduate students do some.
Vanessa, I'm so sorry. Irrelevant what? Oh, I think you cut out for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. A relevant task.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Please jump in if that keeps happening. A relevant task. So specifically, I've had graduate students sometimes do short presentations on a research. I've given them a list of variables in my lab, not so detailed that they could replicate exactly what we're doing, but here's a list of potential variables. What are you interested in a brief 5-minute presentation that's about a research question that they would want to ask. Sometimes I've also given that to them and done that in a question and answer format. I've also sometimes asked them to perform a brief literature search, for instance, for this research technician where their whole job would be performing literature searches. I asked them to perform a literature search, a brief one, find 5 articles related to this topic. And then, we'll come and we'll talk about them together, or read my paper on this, which is related to the project. Come and let's talk about it. I found that that's often much more useful than some of the interview questions that kind of are like, explain a time when you blah, blah, blah. It's really hard to get a sense of the skills that I might be needing. And so that's what's worked for me. But it also gels with the way I run my lab. So I feel like applicants are also getting a sense of this is kind of how it's gonna be if I work for her. So yeah, I'm a little intense with interviewing, but we can talk about different approaches together too. Finally, there's so much other stuff they don't teach us in grad school or beyond, or didn't teach me at least. On leadership and motivation, I think it's been really important for me to figure out a way to make other people care about the research I'm doing just as much as I do. And I think the people who care about that research will automatically gravitate towards it anyway. But sometimes, as you know, research is hard for various reasons. And so sometimes sustaining that motivation is really important to me, to remind my staff and to keep talking about what the mission and vision, values of the research that we're doing are, because I think that reminder can be helpful when the going gets tough. So seeking to recruit those who believe in the mission and vision and values of the research is really important. Nurturing staff's voice and feedback, and not just nurturing their feeling safe to provide it, but also how we respond to it, I think is really important, and I can talk more about that. And like I mentioned, maintaining motivation for the research. People do that in different ways. Some labs have like outings, right? Or they like go to bowling or something like that. I do it in different ways. But I think it's important that we all maintain motivation, especially when we're up against deadlines or we're up against really hard challenges that we're facing. Transparency is something that's really important, right? Telling people not only what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And modeling, I always try to model and consider, am I asking my folks to do something that I wouldn't do, right? And how can I model the type of leader and the type of team member that I want to be for other people? So I'm always self-reflecting on that. And I still have a long way to go in terms of what leadership looks like. That's not something they often teach. And then finally, there's a whole thing that we could talk about with managing conflict. I've had several conflicts in my lab. whether that be between team members and myself, whether that be between team members together. One of my team members made another team member once, so that was, there can be any numbers of types of conflict. And so thinking about a way to manage those interpersonal conflicts, and we can talk about what that might look like, is really important. And not, I think, in my opinion, not shying away from them, but really addressing them as they come up in ways that are respectful of all parties. Okay, I'm going to stop here so we can talk a lot about your thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing your thoughts, your questions, other experiences that you